So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Hajar Ghorbani. I'm a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Alberta. And I'm very pleased to chair today's session. Meaning making, death politics in post-colonial spaces, which is the second webinar in the Decolonizing Death Studies series. This webinar series celebrates the publication of Decolonizing Death Studies and brings together scholars working across different disciplines, methods, and geographies to rethink how death, dying, grief, and mourning are understood beyond dominant Eurocentric frameworks. As you can see, the book is divided into 4 sections: death, rituals, and cultural identity, mediation, representation, and colonial echoes, necropolitics, marginalization and resistance, rewarding, myth, and community. Today's session focuses on how meaning is made around death in post-colonial and neo-colonial contexts, and how grief, mourning, remembrance, and political agency are shaped through histories of colonialism, migration, violence, and lived social realities. Before we begin, I would like to share a brief personal reflection. As a non-Western scholar working in this field, and as someone in the final stage of my PhD program, Decolonizing Death Studies is not only an important academic project for me, but also a deeply formative one. And here I want to acknowledge with real gratitude my experience of working with the 2 amazing my co-editors, Stacey and Pitsillides. I think it wouldn't be fair if I didn't say this clearly here. Over the last couple of years, while working with them, I feel that I gained another kind of degree, honestly. I learned so much, not only intellectually, but also professionally, from the way they work with care, rigor, generosity, and openness. So in this journey, I have learned how seriously they listen to ideas, how thoughtfully they respond, and how they create space for different voices and perspective. So I would like to say again, thank you, Stacey and Pitsillides, for having me and giving me this opportunity. Also, I wanted to thank all the scholars and contributors whose work made this volume possible. Each chapter brings a distinct perspective, and together they make this book a genuinely rich and necessary intervention in the field. Also, I would like to briefly mention the book cover, as you can see in the slide, which still excites me, One of the things I value deeply about this project is that we engage not only scholars, but also artists and photographers in shaping how this work would be presented. The cover, actually, that's selected by Stacey and Pitsillides, features a powerful image of the stone garden in Iran. For those who may not yet have seen the book, I would like to bring a brief story about this garden. This garden created by a deaf-mute farmer from a tribe in the south of Iran. And after losing his land during the 1960s land reforms in Iran, he stopped farming and in act of grief and protest began hanging stones from the dead branches of his trees. Today, this garden is registered cultural heritage site, and the farmer, as you can see in the picture, is buried beside the garden. I myself find it a profoundly meaningful image for a book that invites us to rethink death, mourning, coloniality, and the politics of whose words are seen and heard. Thanks Farshid, the Iranian photographer, for sharing his images from this garden with us. And finally, we are very grateful to the Association for the Study of Death and Society, ASDS, for hosting this webinar series and supporting the circulation of these discussions. Not to forget, I'd like to share one small piece of good news. As part of this webinar series, we are offering one attendee a complimentary hard copy of Decolonizing Death Studies, which we will select by random draw at the end of today's session. So please just stay with us through the discussions and Q&A, and we will announce the winner before we close. Okay, let's go back to the webinar. A few quick heads up. We have 3 presentations today. Each presentation will be approximately 15 minutes. We'll keep question for the Q&A at the end, and please feel free to place your question in the chat box as we go on, or keep them for discussion. Today, we are joined by an excellent panel of contributors, as you can see in the slide. Joshua Hurtado, Stacey Pitsillides, Reem Tahlouk, and Sena Cerci, Jane McCarthy, and Sukhbinder Hamilton. Together, these presentations bring us into conversation the question of necropolitical violence, relationality, migration, reincarnation, political agency, and the colonial shaping of bereavement realities and aftermath. So let's begin with our first speaker, Joshua Hurtado. I will stop my sharing.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Joshua, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, can you see the presentation now? Perfect. So thank you very much to Hajar for the kind presentation, the kind introduction to this session, and to Stacey and Panagiotis for also inviting me to be part of this webinar and to collaborate with one chapter in the edited collection. So I will give a brief summary of what my chapter consists of. My chapter is titled Death, Relationality, and Resistance Against Necropolitical Violence in Latin America. Just to preface this, I will try to go through this quickly or relatively quickly in order for the rest of the presenters to have enough time. And then if you have any more specific questions, we can address them in the Q&A at the end. So why did I choose Latin America as the regional context of analysis? So it is dominated and has been dominated for a while by a savage necropolitical landscape. And this landscape deploys violence to kill people and destroy territories. And it does so because of instrumental reasons, meaning, for example, getting rid of activists or trying to accumulate capital by converting ecosystems into commodities and so on. But Latin America is also a region of multiple ontological disputes. So many people, both indigenous groups and peasants, farmers, and other kinds of land defenders, think of ecosystems as living entities, versus how modern states and corporations tend to think of ecosystems as things sacrificable to capitalism or spaces to be controlled by the coercive force of the state. But Latin America is also a region of resistance movements, where the dead play a central role in configuring those resistances. I come from Mexico, so I know quite a bit of the Mexican context in this regard, and I'm going to present a case from Mexico here, but I also have links to other social and environmental movements in the rest of Latin America, so that's another case I'm going to present. And finally, um, there are, in my experiences at least, I can see some practices of ontological relationality between the living and the dead, including the non-human dead. And I hope that the two cases I present here, which are detailed in the book chapter, can illustrate this idea. So, how do I approach relationality in the context of this chapter? So, I understand relationality as meaning that an entity is constituted by networks of dynamic relationships. This means that any entity, and let's think of a person, is not an individual, an autonomous individual, but its being is dynamically constituted by the relationships that person is a part of. And this entails the networks of other people, but also other animals, ecosystems, and other objects that are part of the surrounding environment. Uh, from a relational perspective, people are partible. Their identity unfolds and evolves over time, and um, specific elements of a person are imprinted on other persons and objects, and equally, elements of the network of relationships are imprinted on the person, so that the identity of every member of the network uh, is only understood and emerges as part of the network. It does not emerge in isolation. So, through this understanding of relationality, I mentioned several examples of the relational dead, or how there are relational connections between the living and the dead. And we see this in many ideas and concepts from the death studies literature. This appears in some way in through the concept of continuing bonds between the living and the dead, ancestors and ancestorhood, memorials, embodied bodily experiences that where the absence of the dead is physically felt. Also, through uh, deadbots or thanabots, which are digital recreations of the dead powered by artificial intelligence, and which, depending on how they are created, they also entail a deep relationality between traces of the dead person, technological elements, and the other members of the network who engage with the deadbots. And there's another chapter in this edited collection that describes the element of deadbots from a decolonial perspective. So that will be covered in the next webinar, I think. Um, the point with relationality and death is that death does not mean the disappearance of the entity from the world. Instead, death modifies how this entity manifests itself in the world. And the death, through understood through relationality, can open horizons of sociopolitical resistance, as I will explain in the cases. Um, so the main idea uh, of thinking of the dead through a relational lens is that traces of the dead remain in the networks of dynamic relationships, and they are carried forward in time after their death. Their death. So a quick methodological note on how I conducted the research in this book chapter. Um, so I needed to have a reflexive approach to my way of examining and relating to each of these cases. I consider myself Western educated. The universities I have gone to are uh, are based on Western ideas and the Western model, and they follow a modern way of thinking. And um, I have been formed professionally and academically in that approach. So that both shapes the way I can understand these cases and also what I am able to understand and feel regarding each of these cases. Um, with the Mexican case that I am going to present, uh, even though I am from Mexico, it is not a case that I have any direct involvement with, or I do not know any of the actors personally, except I do know the lead researcher who first documented this case academically. Her name is Sayak Valencia. I will mention her in a bit. So she gave the most detailed account of the case that I'm going to present. But my presentation of this case comes mostly from secondhand knowledge based on press reports and Sayek Valencia's interpretation of the case. Um, there's also a Peruvian case in which I do have a more direct involvement. I established contact with an indigenous organization in Peru for other projects related to my PhD and also external to my PhD. And I have kept in contact with them throughout the years. And I asked them if I could use some of the material from the interviews I conducted with them for this chapter, and they agreed. So I used fragments of their interviews for making my case of the relationality of between the living and the dead. Um, so I conducted this analysis by focusing on two ideas or concepts uh, that allowed me to examine relationality in more detail, which are the material and affective entanglements, which I will present in the cases. So the first case of postmortem politics in Mexico is the case of Paola Sanchez Romero. She was a trans woman who was murdered by an alleged security guard a decade ago. Um, and the judge let the guard go because of alleged lack of evidence, despite the fact that the moment Paola was murdered, the press was there. There are videos of shortly after the murder of Paola that show her body inside a car and her friends surrounding her and police officers also taking the security guard into custody. So there was quite a bit of evidence, but the judge argued that there was lack of evidence. So he set the security guard free. Because of this, Paola's murder mobilized her network of friends, and a number of protests occurred in Mexico City. Um, and this picture here, this central photograph, is the first big protest in relation to Paola's murder. And this was a widely publicized protest when it was happening. So um, her body, Paula's body, was at the center of the protest. This is the uh, I think this is a non-controversial image in a sense. I mean, this isn't uh, I think this is the most appropriate image I could find of the protest that was also respectful of the people present in it. So her body was at the center of the protest, in the coffin, and this was in a main avenue in Mexico City. This was in Insurgentes Avenue, which is where many cars, public transport, and people pass each day. And because of the location, it quickly received widespread coverage, including the national media. Uh, and this protest tried to show Paula as being present as also part of the protesters, in the sense that her body, uh, her physical presence, was important to show how she was uh, rejecting her murder by a security guard. Um, so my point here is that Paula's murder did not erase her from public life. In fact, through the material entanglements, Paula's body had lively features to signify her presence, even in death. You cannot see her clearly here, but she had a vibrant pink dress, and she had makeup on her that made her seem as alive as possible. But also, shortly after, the the press reached the site and took pictures and videos, and then shared them in national media. So this protest quickly became nationally relevant. Um, but through affective entanglements, Paula's murder and her presence in the protest also mobilized the trans community politically, which had previously been in the margins, but since Paula's murder, they became a well-known political actor in Mexico City. So her murder and her presence inspired networks of solidarity, not only with her own trans community, but with networks of other activists. And just to show the political relevance of this and how it resisted necropolitical violence. The mobilization of the trans community eventually passed a law in Mexico City that made the murder of trans people, specifically uh, a more aggravated case of murder. So there are higher penalties involved with that. Um, there are more details of this case in the work of Sayak Valencia, so please refer to her work on transmortem and postmortem politics. And the second case is the case of the living dead entanglements in Peru, about how they relate to resisting the Amazon's deforestation. So the organization I have contact with is a Quechua indigenous organization that defends the Amazon rainforest, and they live according to a relational ontology, in the sense that they understand themselves as an integral, inseparable part of the Amazon rainforest. Um, Here, the relationality
Joshua,
implies that
sorry,
they.
just a heads up. Just
Yes,
a heads up. 15 minutes passed.
yes, I'm about to finish. Thank you. Affiliates of others, and the ecosystems as deep losses in their network. Um, how this relates to relationality is that the material entanglements uh, through the ecosystem deterioration, this deterioration itself limits further exploitation and increases the material motivation for defending the land. Um, and the effective entanglements manifest as the dead leaders' messages carried forward in time, with the Quechua members willing to risk their lives for ecosystems as part because they see the ecosystems as part of themselves. So the main ideas that I wish to convey in this chapter is that relationality between the living and the dead can operate as a driver for resistance against necropolitical violence in Latin America. The material and effective entanglements of the living and the dead showed how the dead maintain agency in the world of the living. But there's a lingering question that I wish to explore in further projects, which is, can the dead only retain post-mortem agency by proxy, or is there a post-mortem individual agency to still engage in resistance actions? So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua, for the powerful presentation. What I really appreciate in your chapter is the way you show relationality not simply as an abstract concept, but as something that becomes politically active in context of necropolitical violence. Thank you so much. As we move to our next presentation, it's now my pleasure to welcome Stacey, Reem, and Sena. Please go ahead whenever you are ready.
Thank you. You can see my slides, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we're here today to present on Druze reincarnation, migration, political agency, and grief. But before we do that, we wanted to to give a bit of space, hence the blank slide, to express our sadness at the current situation in the Middle East, which are linked to a lot of our homes and to other people who are possibly in the room, and to, share solidarity around being together online and, being people who live in these regions. So I'm going to pass over to Sena to start us off.
Yeah, and thank you, Stacey. I'm gonna give a bit of context on Druze and who they are and what it is and etc. So Druze is an esoteric ethno-religious community. As a religious movement, it started around the 11th century AD. While they adopted an Islamic framework, they have elements of Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, as well as some elements from Hellenistic philosophy and Buddhist mysticism. However, they have diverged quite a lot from these belief systems. For example, they reject prayer, fasting, some of the holy days in comparison to Islam, for example, which it's closest to. It lacks shrines and places of worship, etc. Another aspect of divergence is their belief in reincarnation. So, according to this belief, souls transmigrate to newborn bodies within Druze households at the moment of death. And because of these differences, they are also quite highly secretive and exclusive as a group. Even within the community, they're quite secretive and exclusive because the community consists of Ukal and Juhal. And Ukal is the initiated and the enlightened that engages with the religious texts, whereas the Juhal is the ordinary folks that are not ready to be enlightened, but they're still expected to remain loyal to the community, the faith, and customs and practices, and are as informed by the Ukal. So while this level of secrecy strengthened the community of Druze, it also contributed to Druze being viewed as other and persecuted throughout the history. So they predominantly reside in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. But because of the instability in that region and also wars and internal conflicts, there is a very large Druze diaspora elsewhere, spanning multiple generations and multiple waves of migration. Next slide, please. So what got us really interested with the Druze belief in reincarnation was that it reinforces the very strong sense of community that they already have, because with this belief, all Druze households are shared and cared for regardless of their location. And another thing that got us really interested was that this inherited trauma and memory from the past life actually shapes the lives of the Druze diaspora, as well as their political roles and identities. And we wanted to look at it from a necropolitical perspective. And we also wanted to adopt a design approach to this growing body of queer and decolonial death studies literature. I'm going to hand it over to Reem because she's going to actually talk a bit more about those.
Thank you. So we come at this with a bricolage of individual and joint positionalities as individuals who identify as connected to the Mediterranean region, bringing our own individual and familial migration histories, the intergenerational trauma due to colonization, war, and conflict, as well as a shared investment in the region and the communities and epistemologies. And it was really, I think, the collective grief that we have over the lives, homes, and lands and political agency in the region that brought us together. So what we did is to center Druze ways of generating knowledge, we really approached it as conversations. And me, myself being Druze meant that I was able to have those conversations by embracing relationships that I have with my community, primarily with my parents and friends. And we really kind of viewed our approach as part of kind of critical design studies as a site for decolonial resistance. And so we invited them to come into a virtual space where you can see in the image the seating area is reminiscent of my grandmother's house. We selected which music we want to listen to together and while having our conversations, and also embracing the Druze custom of hospitality of always having food and beverages to share while we engage with one another. All the conversations were done with people who would be grouped as Juhal, and so it was not, our starting point was not the binary religious belief of reincarnation or not, but rather what are the cultural and communal perspectives that come when this belief is within a community that has quite a lot of bonds with one another. Next slide.
Sorry.
So the conversations that we had really kind of focused on us sharing and discussing our intergenerational migration journeys. So kind of tracing back to our different families and their migration, and what being Druze means to how we feel about home. And then we then moved into a co-speculation approach where we asked where they might want to be reincarnated and why. And we use here co-speculation as a way to imagine worlds otherwise, beyond dominant Western paradigms, and to challenge the sociopolitical status quo. And it also helped us move beyond the binary of asking, well, do you believe in reincarnation or not? But rather asking, if you were to be reincarnated in a world that everyone might be reincarnated, where would you want to be and why?
So dead bodies perform migration journeys. We started from that principle, either because they've been repatriated. So when you send bodies overseas, which include bureaucratic challenges of moving bodies, or through force or external actors. So we see that where bodies are moved for other reasons, like the body of Eva Peron or other kind of famous cases where bodies have been moved around. So we're not talking necessarily in that case about migration of living, but also the kind of moving of the dead. So the forceful relocations of the dead are often necropolitical, but they construct also new understandings of place, time, and identity. And we took from that perspective, from the idea of these migration routes, and this is enmeshing of necrogeography with necropolitical agency, to center our thinking from the necropolitics and the movement of bodies to the transmigration of souls, or sorry, I'm not going to try and pronounce the Arabic. Maybe Reem can do that later. But yeah, so this idea that we seek to explore how the presence of reincarnation stories and experiences in Druze society shape existential positions in relation to death, loss, grief, and migration within the community. So we took this as a kind of a slightly playful starting point, as Reem mentioned, but also a real place to think about what migration means post-death and how we might understand it as living people and as a community of care, particularly. So from this perspective, we think about Druze community. So Druze remember their past lives, inherit not only intergenerational trauma of persecution and conflict, but also trauma and loss experienced in their past lives. So there's this kind of doubling up of trauma where in this, as we said, a region which is incredibly destabilized and which links to all of our political grief. And we asked them to imagine with us, our interlocutors, what it might mean to be born somewhere else and how they might feel about it. So, for example, Mama was saying that, Reem's mum, but we call her Mama in the paper. So freeing your soul from the borders, but physically the borders are there. As living people, we are hoping that these borders will be obliterated. So the challenges of being able to travel as a Druze with a Lebanese passport, what that means versus being a Druze with a Canadian passport like Yasin is. So we're seeing these speculations occurring. And, similarly, she's saying, I would be sad if I was reincarnated in the US and never knew Lebanon, because I still think of Lebanon as home. But for some people who live in Lebanon, they are desperate and would love to be reincarnated in Europe or the US. So it depends on the situation. So there was a lot of reflections from all of the people about their connections to home, their connections to Lebanon, and the feeling of, well, it's a difficult place to live in, but it's our home and we feel connected to it and we feel embodied in this place of Lebanon, but we also feel like our bodies can move. So it's actually the home we're connected to is the other Druze in the community, not just ourselves. So that linking of reincarnation to political agency was further echoed both by Baba and Yasin. So Baba saying, any place I can make a difference towards politics is where I'd like to be reborn. Whereas Yasin talking about, yes, without having to go through this suffering or struggle, I have the passport through being reincarnated in Canada. So through being in Canada, Yasin is able to live his life. But if he was to choose, he would want to be born in Lebanon, but with as he mentions in the paper, clean money. So this idea that someone else previously would have had to migrate to America, make the money, and then have birthed him in Lebanon in order for him to live this great life. So there was a lot of reflection on what it meant to be a Druze and how reincarnation shapes the Druze view or the Druze gaze on society. And we talked also with the interlocutors about what it would be like if other people from other cultures were to believe in reincarnation. Would that make a difference to their political understanding of the world if they felt connected to these different places? And there was a range of different opinions around that as well. But some of the kind of things that came out of it was this idea that Druze existence is fluid, interoperable, and intersubjective, quoting from Aramet there. And we used Migalow's 1999 decolonial reframing of Descartes, I think I am where I think. So, linking to space, linking to embodiment, linking to land. In the case of the Druze, this thinking where I am really stretches across locations and translations of the self and the community, the diasporic community with the localized community, which are enmeshed in these cycles of birth, death, migration, and rebirth that perform atemporally and geopolitically. So the Druze community collected globally can help us to think about death, migration, and necropolitics in really new ways that perhaps we haven't thought about before. And for us, this is the beginning of a piece of work. So it's a real opening outwards of this. And as Reem and Sena have reinforced, we are women that live and are surrounded by the Mediterranean Sea. and we feel connected into this region. So we want to start opening out this conversation about migration, mortality, and how these things fit together. And really, in conclusion, to be born in other homes may differ from embarking on other migration journeys that take you away from home. So that's the real difference that we're identifying within the Druze community, is that even in death, there is migration for Druze, and that kind of enmeshing of death and rebirth is part of it. Druze households are connected, disconnected, and reconnected through birth and death. So it's a very different vision of what we might call immortality in Westernized thinking and Westernized thought, where it's literally the self that continues. This is another self that it becomes a much more interconnected and communal version of what we might consider as a form of immortality, although we don't use the word immortality in the chapter. So Druze reincarnation may create potential new futures where political agency and freedom are exercised when rebirth takes place across borders. So that fantasy about getting a passport, or being in a different place, or being born where there isn't war, or being born where you can make a difference, these kind of imaginings are really central to what we were thinking about in this chapter. So Druze reincarnation resists the restriction placed on lives through failed states, borders, and migration controls, all of which are legacies of colonialism. So we are using the Druze gaze to really break down the legacies of colonialism and to think through what this could be otherwise, what could otherwise occur. And Druze reincarnation is also used as a mode of decolonial hope and resistance. And this is from our design background, thinking like, could we redesign this colonial thinking? So a new lens through which we may explore and epistemologically deconstruct the coloniality of borders and the socio-political systems they reinforce. And we'd all, I think, like to say thank you so much to Hajar and to everyone else on the call for listening to us, and also for being able to think with us around this really challenging topic in this really challenging time.
Thank you so much, Stacey, Reem, and Sena, for such a rich and thought-provoking presentation. I deeply appreciate the methodological contribution of your work, especially the way you use conversation and so speculation and design research to create the colonial space for thinking with rather than extracting from interlocutors. As we move to our final presentation, we continue with the question of how coloniality shapes death and grief, but now through a more explicitly conceptual lens. I'm very pleased to welcome Jane and Silk. Thank you both for joining us. Please take it away.
Well, and yeah, we're missing the first slide. Here's our first slide with its pretty color. Yeah, the title of our chapter is Surrendering to Death and Its Aftermath, Conceptual Explorations in the Era of Coloniality and Modernity. And I'm one of the authors with Sukh, who's also here today, and we're going to share the presentation between us, but I'm going to introduce it. So in terms of setting the scene, this is part of a bigger body of work that we're involved with, which very much is focused on decentering or resisting coloniality, modernity in the face of existential threat. So unlike some of the other chapters in the book, we're particularly focused on the living after a death. And we approach it through an emphasis on lived experiences of death and its aftermath. And we did choose that language deliberately. Much more commonly, it's referred to as bereavement and grief. But we find that language quite problematic. And interestingly, in overlap with the previous chapter presentation, we have engaged in conversational explorations, but these are between ourselves. This is the third chapter that we've used this approach, and the very first one we did was with also Berenice Golding. And each time we've approached how to conduct the conversations and how to present them somewhat differently. But what it does seriously emphasize is where are we speaking from, And I will introduce myself in that regard, and Sukh, I think, will introduce herself in a moment. But I am white and I am English. I'm English. My English ancestors go back generations, centuries, very much rural labourers until they moved into the East End of London. So that's where I'm speaking from. And part of the emphasis of what we do, I'm aware that it can be slightly tricky ground, perhaps slightly contentious about how we deal with rhetoric when we're trying to do decolonizing work. And there's a fear that decolonizing can end up as being just a new form of rhetoric without a significant relationship to actual politics and power. But in this case, what we're trying to do, I think, is actually make the rhetoric itself problematic. And in many respects, I think we could regard this as kind of like we're taking models of grief, for example, and treating them as rhetorical rather than scientific productions. So, and obviously focusing on the language of how bereavement and grief are generally talked about is absolutely central. And in this particular case, what we're doing, we start from a focus on acceptance, the language of acceptance, which is very strong in terms of bereavement ideas. And personally, that came from my own history of my husband died 25 years ago when our daughter was very young. And one of the ways I was struggling afterwards was I thought, well, I have to accept that this has happened. But what I then found was that when I was in conversation with other women, who had, and these were white English women, I think. When I used that word, they resisted it very strongly. And I began to think, oh, what's going on in this word acceptance? And where we get to in our chapter, what we're trying to emphasize really is the ontological assumptions, not just the epistemological consequences of the language that we use. So very strongly concerned with and that death and existential threat absolutely require consideration of ontology and cosmology. So concern with onto-epistemological justice. But also a word of warning that we're very conscious of in this chapter is where do words fit into the way we are in the world? And we cite an article there that talks about the ontological differences between wording and worlding the world. So does wording the world marginalize worlding the world? So in starting this work together, Sukh suggested, because I'd been thinking about this word acceptance and reading around it and from different angles for quite a while, and Sukh suggested that I might do a diagram to just try and encapsulate visually some of what might be involved. So lived experience is absolutely central, but we focus particularly on these 4 key words: acceptance, of which the opposite is sometimes seen as denial, but also introducing the language of surrender, and in contestation with surrender, the possibility of resistance, but very aware that there's all these different disciplines that might have something to say about these terms. But more importantly, that everything that we're examining about these dominant ways of thinking about bereavement and grief are rooted in colonial modernity and whiteness and capitalism, and make very strong claims to universality, which are slightly getting modified, but that has been the history of this way of thinking about grief. And I'm going to pass over to Sukh next.
Yeah, so I'm Sukhbinder Hamilton, Sukh Hamilton, and my heritage is Punjabi Sikh, but I was 5 months old when my family moved to the UK. So to use Joshua's framing, I've been shaped within a particular setting. And so for me, this work is particularly interesting, and actually sort of drawing on the previous two presentations. I think it's very interesting how they do mesh together, because, you know, I've just sort of said about what Joshua had said, but thinking about sort of Reem, Sena's and Stacey's presentation, as Jane said, about the conversation and how there is this sense of inherited trauma and place, time, space perspective. And actually, that's been very pertinent to my upbringing, because whilst my upbringing has been shaped by very much colonial frameworks, my heritage has brought a very different relationality to that. So thinking about this chapter has been quite useful for us as women who come from very different backgrounds to be able to actually converse about this. So our approach has always been about lived experience, as James said, and we use our experiences, which, you know, there is a racialized element, to actually unpick. So this slide is an example of how we shape our conversations, in that we get together. The writing is usually the last thing that happens. It's usually the conversation, and it's essentially a stance of collaborative autoethnographic conversations, and particularly sort of focusing on collaborative feminist decolonizing methodology. And we've been developing it for a little while, and we are in the process of starting to write it up as a new methodology. But we start with the language, we record the conversations, and then that conversation is unpicked to look at collaborative terms and what they mean to us specifically, and then thinking about how that meaning has been shaped and evolves through our own personal experiences, so that we can then unpick the nuances and look at what those hesitations within that is, so that we can then start to do some sort of meaning making. And so, as you can see here, the conversation is the top, so Jane and myself, and then the comment is actually us going back and unpicking and trying to sense make. I'll hand it back to Jane now.
Thanks very much, Sukh. Yeah, one of the things I forgot to mention actually was that Sukh and I are both sociologists, and I think that's really quite significant for this, the ways our conversations develop, and sometimes for how we write them too, actually. I mean, we're sociologists in slightly different contexts. My history has been more about families and relationality, and Sukh more of a focus on education. But I do think it's really quite important that we are both sociologists, for better or for worse. So in terms of where does this take us? First of all, does this actually matter? Trying to deconstruct this term acceptance and surrender and the nuances that surround it. Well, it matters initially and most obviously that they are very, acceptance is very crucially part of the very dominant Anglophone models of grief, which talk about grief as processes or as stages or as tasks. One of the particularly well-known writers in the field is William Warden, whose book is very much used as training material for people who are training as bereavement counsellors. And so, for example, he says that the very first task of grief is to accept the reality of the loss. The first task of grieving is to come full face with the reality that the person is dead. The person is gone and will not return. Part of the acceptance of this reality is coming to believe that reunion is impossible And he does add the caveat, at least in this life. And then in opposition to that, he talks if you don't accept the death, then you're in denial. So in that case, you haven't accepted the reality of the loss. You're not believing through some type of denial. And that denial can be practiced on several levels and take various forms. But one example, he calls denial forms of delusion or distortion, such as the person who sees the deceased embodied in one of his or her children. So what that conveys to me very strongly is that this notion of acceptance is very much bound up with a notion of a particular ontological assumption about what reality consists of, which was part of the conversation that shaped the previous slide. And
it's within a very Western framework and a very, Jane and I have had this conversation that it is very much in a psychology or psychological based framework. And as sociologists, obviously, we take issue with that.
Yeah, thanks, Sukh. It matters too in terms of if one of the other things we do in the chapter is explore different definitions in the dictionary and conceptual diversities. So sometimes it is about accepting reality in that sense, but sometimes it's also about acceptance has another meaning of being included in something, accepted into a community, but also consent. And that's a very strong kind of tension in terms of accepting a death. But and then, of course, issues of translation and the deep significance of translation in terms of framing the world and ways of being in the world in particular ways. And I don't know if you wanted to say something about that, Sukh. We do have an example in the chapter, don't we?
We do. I mean, we sort of thinking about framing the world, and I'm just drawn back to your presentation, Reem, Sena and Stacey, about how the people you talked about how they, if they had the opportunity to come back, how they would utilize the tools and the freedoms of being born in the West, but still be able to exist in their home. And that actually is also true for me in terms of my family, not necessarily for me personally, but thinking about my parents and thinking about my father, for example, who often talked about this idea of acceptance, but also reincarnation and going back to his roots. And I think the problem is, Jane, we could just carry on and on and on.
Well, okay, I'll whiz us through the rest of the slide and bring us to a conclusions. But so arguing that it matters, in that case, how do we respond? And certainly the first element, I think, is to recognize such dominant ontological assumptions and how they're just not noticed if we're not careful in the language that we're using. And that's what that first quote was about in terms of wording the world. But also, of course, it raises issues about different ways of knowing and of what counts as knowledge. And very much, I think it does take us towards pluriversality, not universality. And pluriversality of cosmologies and the different ways of being in the world that are associated with those. But in terms of responding, I know that one possible discussion that happens is whether a braiding of knowledge is possible. And I think that's a really open question. I think what we're trying to do with this work mostly is open up spaces for more discussion and more conversations. We're not necessarily providing answers. There's lots of tensions and dilemmas, but most fundamentally of all, it opens up existential questions. So where do we find our ontological security and trust when we're faced with issues of human mortality and uncertainty? And within colonial modernity, the primary response is very materialistic. When you're dead and gone. But now in the current world, exploring the possibilities that technology might actually be able to defeat death and give us eternal life. And what, of course, that does is very much marginalize spirituality. It's very little scope for thinking about spiritual aspects of death and dying, or the aftermath of death. And yeah, but spirituality can encompass so many different ways. And of course, that's probably the majority way of responding to death around the world. Or is there something else, some other way? So thank you for your attention. And yeah, just to identify who we are and the open societal challenge that we're working with a network of people. And our challenge is called existential disconnections. So thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane and Suk, for the deeply careful and generative presentation. I think it's a very important reminder that decolonizing death studies is not only about expanding cases and geographies, but also about examining the categories through which death and mourning are recognized and governed. Thank you so much again. Before starting the Q&A, we've now completed the random draw. So I would like to announce the winner. Congratulations, Alice Mezanot, if I pronounce it correct. Alice, are you
Yes.
here?
Yes, I am. Wow,
Okay,
thank you so much.
congratulations.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, you are the winner of a complimentary hard copy of Decolonizing Death Studies. So if you're comfortable, please send your email address in the chat or contact us after the session, and we will follow
Okay.
up with detail for sending your copy. Congratulations again.
Thank you so much. Wow, that's amazing.
Of course. So now we will now open the floor for discussion and Q&A. I'll give everyone a moment to think. Please feel free to raise your hands or post your question in the chat.
Yeah, I can see some people are also saying that they're leaving. Thank you so much. I know we've run over, so obviously if you can stay for another little bit, we'll do a few questions, but apologies, we had a few technical issues and some other things across the journey today, and we appreciate you coming to listen to the talks, and obviously they'll be published afterwards in the webinar format.
Stacey, there is a question. Is the book available as an ebook so we can order it for our library?
Indeed, it is. Yeah. So you should be able to order that as well. Yeah. And then can we get the book from other bookshops than Amazon? Yeah, it's available to order directly from Routledge, and I think it's from other places. Banyotis, I think, is more on this question than me.
It is available anywhere and everywhere, from my understanding. But I'll put a link in the chat directly to Routledge that gives the option for the ebook, and the librarians would know if it is about an institution.
Any questions, any thoughts, comments, feedbacks? I can start with a question. Okay, go ahead. Somebody raised. No?
I'm gonna
Banyotis.
wait, Hajar. You go ahead and I'll come in next.
Okay. My question is, was there a term in your chapters, each of the actually authors, that didn't translate easily across context or disciplines or languages? Any of you?
I mean, I can jump in. I don't think this was a term that doesn't translate in terms of languages, but I think doesn't translate epistemologically to us or reflect the ontologies, because we really struggled, like, how do we talk about our joint positionalities when we, so for example, Stacey's from Cyprus, that's part of the EU. Sena is from Turkey. So I'm from Lebanon, no, and I think the language of the Middle East and that terminology we really struggled with, and that's how we ended up landing on connected to that Mediterranean regions. So I think part of our learning was unlearning some of these colonial languages that do not translate to our values or how we view the world and our relationship to one another in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Go ahead. Go.
I think we also view the kind of connection to each other and that kind of link in a similar way to we view the connection across the Druze community, which is quite interesting. But also in terms of language, I think it was really interesting for us because obviously I don't speak you know, Arabic, and Reem was doing the interviews with her parents and other people in different languages. So there was an element of kind of translation in this thing. But then I listened to the interviews because they were partially in English. So I was able to get some of the feeling of the interviews through that. So like I think that there was a really interesting layered approach where some of it we're kind of listening to and hearing the voice and hearing and getting to know the interview people ourselves, but some of it also through Reem and so there's always this kind of through way to kind of get to the point of the language. And as I said in the presentation, I can't pronounce the terms. I won't even try because that would be, possibly worse. So yeah, there's all these different layers of, how we were thinking and talking together about doing this work. And certainly also similarly, if we were doing work in Cyprus with Greek or with Turkish or with other languages, we'd have similar issues in other ways.
Thank you so much. There is a question here. Have you seen the colonial values and language being adopted in the colonial countries?
I think, can I just jump in here? I think one of the problems with terminology, is that it is problematic because we talk about colonial values, we talk about colonial countries, but coming back to the idea of movement of people, and it's not just people that move, it's values that move, and you start getting this hodgepodge of mixtures, and so it suddenly becomes very confusing because, as Audre Lorde says, we want to dismantle the master's house, but hang on, we're using those tools, and we ourselves now in the West are very much shaped without even knowing about it through this lens. And so trying to unpick these different things, and as Jane was saying, for us, this language is problematic. So where do we start? It's a massive tapestry that needs to be unwoven, I think, thread by thread. Don't know if anyone else wants to say anything.
Thank you so much. Pane,
I wasn't going to offer an answer to that question. I was going to ask a question of the speakers, and I think this comes in and underpins the conversation linked between these three chapters as well, and beyond, because the conversation, I think, between the co-authors continues. But thinking about the necropolitical lenses through which the understandings of those analyses come through, if I make my question a little bit more concise, because the question is, how does temporality shape necropolitical power in those discourses in your own work? And specifically, I'm thinking of how does control over time, the delays, the waiting, the prolonged death, how does control over time then function alongside the control over the life and death of individuals, particularly in deprived nations?
I could come in and say something about that because I've recently been reading the work of Hajar, and one of the arguments he makes is that death and life are not binaries, they're a continuum. And what that means is that for people who are whose histories and heritage and lineage carries a lot of violence and proximity to death, the relationship with death is quite different, and so the relationship over time is quite different. So seeing death and life as a binary, it makes it an event, doesn't it, rather than a continuum that goes across your whole life.
And if I can just jump in and add to that, and please Stacey and Sena jump in as well. I think like with our work, it was interesting to see how reincarnation liberated over time. Like it provided hope or spaces for potential liberations, but at the same time, people were still feeling that political grief of losing home, and even with the liberation of being born somewhere else. So over time, they still are thinking, well, I'll still be grieving not being born home. But then also in one case, via Cian, because of the kind of colonial logics and oppression and a lot of the oppression within Lebanon and economic oppression, he could not imagine being born in Lebanon, being able to make clean money that is not infused with corruption and remnants of the colonial structures and within the Lebanese nation building. So even that temporality of being reborn another and having another life with more money was still tainted with that fear of what if the money I have comes from a corrupt source? And that's what they meant by clean money. So you can see kind of the persistence of those oppressions, even within the imagination of being liberated through time and space.
And just
Thank
briefly, if I may, to touch on those points, I think from the perspective of my chapter, and this is also informed by Sayak Valencia's work, I think the necropolitical landscape in Latin America seeks to control time in the sense of enforcing a finalist conception of death, where death is the end of the possibilities for the entities, but the movements that try to resist that necropolitical violence uh, in a way try to show that death is not something that puts a finality to agency, let's say, and agency in a human sense, but also in a more relational, ecosystemic sense, also continues after death. So I think there's more of that's a way of understanding time from the perspective of my chapter, but also in the case of Sayak Valencia's work, I think necropolitics in Latin America tries to wear out and tire the members of the different social movements that try to resist necropolitical violence, so that they stop being obstacles in a sense for the state and for capitalism and the agents of these structures. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Joshua. We have two more questions. Eleni, do you mind if I ask you to?
Yeah. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, I would like to say thank you so much for such a compelling and important book at these really, really difficult times. It really warmed my heart to listen to all of you, and I want to express my solidarity to the whole of the Middle East. And I have to say that I'm so ashamed that Greece is participating in such an active way in this illegal and atrocious war, really. Um, but yeah, my question, and I hope it it will make sense, because we have been speaking. I really enjoyed Joshua's framing everything in terms of relationality, and I could see the connection with what Reem and the rest of the presenters were saying, um, and how we can see that in different spiritual traditions outside the West, this spiritual linkage of relationality with living beings and the earth and the land and water, um, it's so apparent. And it just came to my mind the contradiction, and especially because I was hearing to the Minister of War in the United States yesterday saying that God dictated this war in Iran because it will bring the Armageddon and Jesus will come, etc. So I was like, how can we bring this relationality to the West? Again, like even in like within Christianity, like I don't know. It's a question I have, that I don't know if it can be answered. But yes, thank you. I would be grateful for your thoughts.
I mean, I can give like a small example because we did discuss this as part of our work in terms of like, do you think that if more people thought that they would be reincarnated, that we'd care for our lands and earth and can build on that relationality? My mom's first response was like, well, no, because even Druze litter. So, no, but I think we played around with that, and I think it was hard because like they even like start thinking, well, what if Trump gets reincarnated? If Trump knew he would be reincarnated and that potentially might be somewhere that he's bombing, do you think that would change whether he bombs or not? And the answer was no. And I think a part of that is because so much of our worlds, I think we need to acknowledge the time that we are in, where we are kind of moving towards that post-capitalism, the Anthropocene, and that grief that I think a lot of people hold, it's hard to let go. It's hard to reimagine futures that are hopeful at this time. And I think even though we did a lot of that speculation work with them that could have opened up that space, letting go of that grief of loss of politics, of loss of land is hard and it's persistent. And so I think these systems are hard for us, not just to dismantle in reality, but dismantle in our imaginaries. And that's what we're trying to do as a starting point.
And I also want to say something brief. This comes from theory more than practical aspects, but I think if this idea of relationality could take hold in you know public officials or figures of structural importance, I think something would need to rupture or disrupt their worldview and their way of being. Exactly what that is, I think, depends on the individual and the context they live in. But having experienced this disruption, then that would be the moment in which somehow we could orient them to engage in other ways of being and in other ways of thinking. This is a very abstract answer, but I think this moment of rupture is necessary in order for them to be open to other ways of being. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone. And I'll just step in, maybe to wrap this up a little bit. I'm mindful of time, and it's been so wonderful that people have had the interest stayed behind and had this conversation with us. And it's quite exciting to see all of you here. And maybe I just want to raise a couple of points before we round this up. And initially, just to say that there's a key theme emerging from the conversation, I think, which is that the decolonization, perhaps, of death requires more than just critique and analysis. It requires something much deeper, and it requires us to rethink really whose knowledge is that counts in shaping how death is perceived, conceived, and moored, and narrated, and politicized, and all the sorts of things that we see around the world. And that can happen even via epistemological approaches by ourselves, sometimes unintentionally. What are those epistemologies through which we understand death, even though when it is done in that decolonization intent? Another important point that I wanted to highlight before we wrap it up is that the idea of the temporal dimensions of necropolitics, and I think still that it is something quite relevant across the board. In fact, my question was the point that all of you made, and I'm glad that you did. And when we see death sort of under that colonial and maybe post-colonial condition, then often it's not only a moment, but that it happens. It's exactly what Jane was saying. It's not that event, but it's really a prolonged process and an experience, which of course different cultures will have different ways of expressing that. And as just to turn this around and kind of like say, we're here and we had this opportunity to have these dialogues because of this project, the book, that I would like to return in words back to Hajar and say, how wonderful working with Hajar, but also Stacey has been. It's a fantastic little working group we had, and a great space for conversations for all three of us. So I hope. So thank you to both of them, and the book really. That was its primary intent, to initiate some further dialogues and to record them on paper as well, because of course it's not exhaustive. There's a lot more that can be said. And finally, I will say that, apologies, I'm losing my voice here, but but finally, I'll say that I think the panel today and following through the presentations and the interactions between the participants and the attendees, it sort of reminds us that thinking about death is not just about the loss, it's about responsibility. So thinking about death and thinking about dying and thinking about bereavement, it's about responsibility. So it's about, whether that's intellectually or politically, it's about how to continue to open up the space and open spaces where all the different and especially the often silenced voices could be contributing to that conversation and can emerge with the invaluable contribution they can make. And so on that note, and unless anyone else would like to share something very important at this stage, I want to thank every person
Very
here.
brief one, just to say also lots of thank yous to everyone and to the speakers today, but also to Hajar. Like as Panayoti said in the comments, we've learned as much from you as you have perhaps from us, and like we really appreciate having you and all the writers as part of this project. And sorry, I'll pass back to Panayoti, but I just wanted to say that as well.
Good, that's excellent. No, I was just at the point of saying that I wanted to thank everyone for being part of this conversation, for the work that you each do, because there's such richness in the work we all do in all these little corners of the world. And so thank you to all the speakers for today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making this such a wonderful, interesting conversation. And we hope to see you for the third and last webinar of this kind of three-part launch of the series. And here is also a link in the chat with the information and the way to register for the third one as well. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Hajar, for chairing today. That was wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody.